years ago now, Brooklyn Beckham, son of David and Victoria Beckham, released a photography book, and I had absolutely no idea it existed until these memes started popping back up again on Reddit, and I just knew I had to buy this book. Now, if you don't know Brooklyn, he is, like I say, the son of footballer David Beckham, pop star turned fashion designer Victoria Beckham, although you may know him more recently for being an absolute nutter in the kitchen and revolutionising the world of cocktail making with his gin and tonic.
I'm very experimental. You know, I'm a nutter in the kitchen. You get Monkey 47. I pour about that much, quite a lot of mint, and you give it a quick squeeze, just so it gets all the smells out. Tonic water. That's like a forest drink. There's like so many like different greens and stuff in there. I don't know if anyone's ever had canned lychee. It is so good. You guys should try it.
Other than that, the Beckhams aren't really people I've ever taken that much of an interest in, other than the fact that I will sing along to pretty much any Spice Girls song that comes on in a bar ever. And also I think Bend It Like Beckham is a quality film and you can't convince me otherwise, although Beckham isn't really in it other than like a 10-second cameo at the end, if that. Other than that, I don't really know much about the family in general. I'm not really one for following football or sport and But you guys know me. Not knowing who a celebrity is has never stopped me ripping apart their books before, so let's do that today. It turns out though that Brooklyn's book, What I See, is quite hard to find these days. It hasn't had any reprints. You can no longer buy it new on Amazon, it's just not in stock. There is one single used copy on there going for like 30 quid, which is ridiculous. I was like, I'm not spending that on a book by Brooklyn Beckham. I'm so glad I didn't, having read it, experienced it, we'll say. So I had to buy the ebook, the Kindle version, which still cost me 10 quid. 10 quid! £9.50 more than it's worth, but here we are, the things I do for you guys. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at Brooklyn Beckham's photography book titled What I See, all lowercase because like that's the aesthetic or whatever the kids say these days. I don't know. Yeah. Now this might come as a shock to a few of you who know me mostly for speaking about poetry or feminism or atheism, but my first love in life has always been photography. It's like my thing, my passion. I adore it. My sister gave me this old second-hand point and shoot cheap little plastic camera that took APS film when I was maybe like 5 or so, and I fell in love and haven't put a camera down since. My first paid job, so not including the like charity work I did in like some charity shops and animal shelters and stuff, my first paid job when I was 14 was actually working in a pharmacy with a photo lab. I spent 4 and a bit years there developing people's photos and printing photos, both kind of like regular amateur people and professional photographers. I later worked for Folio Album, where I was involved in making handmade, really high quality photo albums, working again directly with professional photographers. I paid my way through uni by working as an event photographer, gig photographer, occasionally doing little extra bits like portraits or sometimes product photography, that kind of thing. And I also spent a year as my university's photography society's darkroom manager and another as their training manager. So every week I was teaching people how to develop their own films, how to print their own photos manually in a darkroom, and then after that I was teaching lessons on everything from like beginner photography to more advanced techniques. I was running workshops, I was like kind of leading little like photography walking tours and stuff. We had a whole studio set up that I would teach people how to use. We would do like specialist classes every week on different kinds of photography, so you know, portraiture, landscapes, gig photography, food photography, like everything. We would do different things, basically something for everyone. So I have a lot of experience with photography. Mostly nowadays I just shoot for fun. So if you follow me over on Instagram, you might see I post quite a lot of photos. I've recently just been posting a lot of holiday snaps from when I went to Paris with Kieran. You'll also see just like other things that I take for fun. So like, you know, I do a lot of nature shots and I love mushrooms. I photograph a lot of mushrooms and stuff like that. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I'm like the best photographer in the world. I know I'm not, but I'm decent and I do know my stuff. And I also kind of know my limits. I feel like there are some areas of photography that are not my strong point, like, I'll be honest, or ones that I'm just not that interested in. Like, I'm not really that big into landscape photography myself. I'm not huge into street photography, stuff like that, but some people love it. Where I really shine is gig photography, but I'll tell you more about that in a second. I have always felt for a lot of my life I've been sort of limited by the kit I've had because, you know, I kind of came from nothing. I grew up in a very poor working class family. I was working 2 jobs throughout my time at sixth form and stuff like that. I've always had to work very hard for everything I've wanted. So I've always had to like spend years saving up for the cameras and equipment I've had, and I've never had the highest end stuff. I used to have an old Fujifilm bridge camera that, oh my god, I have some stories about that. Absolute monster of a thing. Struggled with that one. And then eventually I got my old trusty Canon 550D when I was 18 or 19, and since then I've basically just had to make do with an 18 to 135 kind of upgraded kit lens essentially. And then for a while I had the 40mm 2.8 pancake lens, which was a beautiful, very versatile little baby, but that sadly broke earlier this year and I was heartbroken because I'd had that lens like 8 years and oh, I loved it. It went everywhere with me. So I replaced that with the Sigma 30mm 1.4 because I want something with a bit of a bigger aperture. It's okay. I have some issues sometimes with like chromatic aberrations and stuff in my images, but mostly it's a solid lens, very reliable, does what I need it to. While I really like photography, I do sometimes feel a little limited by my kit or lack of, and the stuff I use is kind of like solidly mid-tier. That said, I do think I've got pretty good at kind of making do with what I have, and I think where I do really shine is my gig photography, so photographing live music and events and things like that. When I get the chance to do it in a venue that has good lighting and space to move, I'm good, and I know I can be good, and I'll defend myself on that for a long time. So as some examples, here are a few of my like favourite shots that I've taken recently. So here are some great photos of Postmodern Jukebox performing in Leeds, supposed to go with a guy that I was seeing, and then he turned out to be a massive douchebag, and I was really, one of the things I was most upset about was not being able to see Postmodern Jukebox. So my friend Joe was like, why don't you just buy your own ticket and go on your own? I was like, yes. So I did that and I had the best time and it was wonderful. They were really, really fun to photograph. And also shout out to Maris, who is amazing. I think she's incredible, and when I posted a few of these photos on Instagram, she actually messaged me to be like, oh my god, I can't believe you know who I am. I watch your videos. And we both had this like little fangirl moment about each other, and it was very sweet because I adore her and I think she's wonderful, and I had no idea she watched my videos and she had no idea I liked her music, and it's cool. She's a very, very lovely person from the brief chats we've had, and if she's watching this, hi, I think you're great and you're very fun to photograph. Then we have a few photos of my friend Charles playing at O'Meara in London. You might know him by his stage name King Charles. Again, wonderful man, I adore him. And also this is just a really, really beautiful old venue. The lighting was stunning, the band he had with him was incredible, and I think this set of photos is probably one of my favourite full, complete like sets of gig photos I've done. I just think they're wonderful. I mean, it helps that Charles is a stunning man, but everything just kind of came together and made those photos work really, really well, and I had a great time shooting these ones. Here's a few shots of the Hoosiers playing at Glastonbury this year. Most of the time when I was at Glastonbury, when I wasn't performing there, I was off watching other performances and shooting them and taking loads of photos. I took thousands of photos at Glastonbury. I filled an embarrassing number of memory cards, but the Hoosiers were one of my favourite performances of the week. The lighting was fantastic, they were really, really fun to photograph, and I've since spoken to their bass player, who is like a lovely guy, and one of the other guys from the band messaged me as well, but I don't know who, because it was just from the band's main account and they didn't sign it off, so I don't know which one of them it was, but they ended up using some of my photos to promote a gig they were playing with McFly, which was really, really cool, and it was like an honour for them to use my photos like that, because I've been a fan of theirs since I was like 15 I'd say, so that was amazing. And I've also just released my own little book, which is a collection of 17 poems and a bunch of my photography to go alongside it. While it's not like a big book like Brooklyn's, and it's, I mean, in size or length or anything like that, it's still something, and I'm really proud of it. It is called Reflections on Healing, and it's available to buy on Amazon now. I'm going to do a proper release video kind of talking about it once I get my author copies through, but they always take a while because Amazon. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling too much about myself. I could talk about photography forever. The point is, I like taking photos, and I've spent my entire life taking photos, which is nearly 30 years. Although I guess only like 25 or so of those have been actually actively taking photos. And I spent my entire working life as well, either taking photos, printing photos, working alongside both amateur and professional photographers of all qualities and standards. So when it comes to photography, I know my stuff. And that is why I feel qualified to review and be quite critical of Brooklyn Beckham's photography book. Why is his name so hard for me to say? Now, before we even open the book, I want to take a quick look at the reviews used to market this, because I think they give us a very good idea of what we're getting into with this book. Please bear in mind, these quotes I'm going to show you here, these are reviews from Amazon's product description of this book, which means the publishers sent this book out to several media outlets and probably a bunch of reviewers and famous people and other authors, other photographers to get reviews, because this is what big publishers do. They send out advanced copies, they get quotes, and they put the best ones either in the product description or on the book itself to help market it, like a seal of approval, you know? So the publishers clearly did this with Brooklyn's book, and these were the best of what they got back. These are the best reviews his book got. Real, and also they're from sources that I've never heard of before at all, so they're not reputable, they're not other photographers, they're... Real Clear Life said, in his first book, What I See, the budding photographer offers a glimpse into his life through his own words and collection of personal photographs. The collection of around 300 photographs were mostly taken by Brooklyn, but some shots were taken by others. It documents his travels around the world and his life at home with his family. Okay, so that's not really a review, that's more of just a description of the content than any opinion. And if you kind of move the snide comment aside about how Brooklyn didn't even take a lot of these photos himself, that aside, there's not really anything to this. So, okay, factual, but not an opinion, not a review. Let's move on. Then they have this quote from justjared.com, where instead of giving their own opinion, they just quoted another article, which then quotes Brooklyn Beckham. So this is basically Brooklyn Beckham talking about his own book to promote it. I never thought I would actually be an author, Brooklyn told W Magazine, but it's been really fun and a cool experience seeing how much I've changed, and my mum and dad are really proud of me, which is dope. So Brooklyn's marketing team, to promote his book, used a quote from a website, which was a quote from a magazine quoting Brooklyn himself. This is laughable. This is ridiculous. And then my favourite one is from Daily News, who said, and this is like the only like actual review on there, but Daily News said, if there's one thing Brooklyn Beckham made clear in his first ever photo book, it's that nearly half of his favourite pictures are of Brooklyn. And it's funny because it is true. Oh my god, just like, who approved putting these in the product description? Whoever it was, fire them. At this point, just leave the review section out of the product description altogether, please. Oh my god, okay, so we're gonna open up the book, we're gonna look inside, and it starts with an introduction of Brooklyn telling us why he got into photography. And oh god, like I don't want to judge too harshly because like he was only 18 when he released this, but the whole introduction here is written with like the voice and the ability of maybe like a 12-year-old at max. It sounds like a year 7 kid writing a, "Ooh, what I did on my holidays" piece, you know? Overly simplistic sentences, no depth, no self-reflection, no real value for the reader. Literally, his sentences are as complex as, "I feel very fortunate, full stop. It was a Fujifilm, full stop. I remember it so clearly, full stop. I'm not great with words, full stop. I love drawing and being creative, full stop. But pictures are the way I communicate best, full stop." Do you see what I mean? I feel a little harsh critiquing this because I do wonder if maybe he's got some kind of like learning disability or like he struggles or whatever, but in a book that's clearly had this much money put into it, that's literally published by, I think it's Penguin Random House, like when you have that much money behind it, get an editor, get a ghostwriter. There's no excuse for it being this bad in a published book, you know? Anyway, that said, to actually summarise some of the things he says, when he was 14 he was struggling in school, so his dad gave him a camera because he was frustrated, and the camera and taking photos became a bit of an outlet for him. That in itself I think is pretty admirable, and I think it's very relatable for a lot of people. I've no complaints about like the content of what he wrote there, just complaints about how it's written, I guess. He then goes on to list his photography related achievements, which aren't many, I'll be honest. He took one photography class once. He's been around other people's photo shoots. He made a photo diary for Pull & Bear, and then he says he shot a fragrance campaign for Burberry. And at first I couldn't tell if that meant he was behind the camera or the one modelling. Turns out he was the one behind the camera. But when you read this whole introduction, it just says to me that this book shouldn't be called What I See, but maybe just retitle it to something more accurate, like Nepotism in Practice, you know? I feel mean with how much I'm laughing at this book and the content and everything Brooklyn's done, but it's a lot.
I'm a nutter.
I decided to Google the Burberry campaign that he shot. And like I say, it turns out he did photograph this when he was 16. So he'd only been taking photos for 2 years. And he didn't get this job because he has a natural gift for photography. He got this job because of who his parents are and because of what his name is. And they thought it would be a good like marketing gimmick, you know? I did some Googling, I saw the photos, they're very generic photos, and I also saw some articles and reviews about the photos. One of them was a Guardian article titled Sheer Nepotism, Brooklyn Beckham Burberry Shoot Angers Photographers, and another was an article by Jonathan Jones titled Brooklyn Beckham's Burberry Campaign, The Art Critic's Verdict, which said, I'm just gonna read you a few choice quotes here. Brooklyn Beckham is no Nan Golding, but there is still nothing inherently wrong with a teenage model who happens to have famous parents being asked to shoot Burberry's latest campaign. He's not the first model to go behind a lens. The great Lee Miller went from fashion model to heroic war photographer, but Beckham is no Lee Miller either. In fact, it's hard to make any meaningful comparison of his work with any good photographer because his pictures for Burberry have zero artistic distinction. Brutal. It gets worse as well. It gets worse. In each image, young men and women are juxtaposed, clad in the very height of fashion and looking very lovely, in a slightly bland way. As art, however, these photographs do not exist. To call his photographs a bit tame is like saying a hamster is not a very fearsome animal. These pictures have no bite and no drama and nothing to say. They don't even exhibit the banality of evil or kitsch, just banality light. Is it really this boring to be Brooklyn Beckham? This is brutal. This is more brutal than me. But also I can't disagree. Everything he said is so accurate. Although, to give Brooklyn a shred of credit, at least the Burberry photos show he's vaguely competent at photography, unlike the photographs in this book. At least the Burberry photos are in focus and properly exposed, which is more than can be said for 80% of this book. The cynic in me wants to say he probably had quite a bit of help on that shoot, but maybe not, maybe not, maybe. I found myself entirely conflicted throughout making this whole video because part of me wants to say, oh, he's only a teenager, bless him. Like, of course his skill and point of view haven't completely developed yet, and, you know, we can't be too harsh on this book because he was so young and that sort of thing. But then the other part of me wants to be like, no, that shouldn't matter when we're looking at the quality of commercial work and art objectively, you know? If we're paying for this content, if we're being charged for this content, we should be able to critically review the content regardless of who made it or why. If you're too young to have developed the skill for your book to be good, don't make a book yet. Simple as that. Back in the introduction to the book, Brooklyn then falls back on tired cliches like how they say a picture says 1,000 words, and I love the way images can tell a story, and then it ends with him being shocked about how, when I was approached about curating my photos to publish in a book, I was amazed. I didn't think anyone was watching. Really, Brooklyn? Really? You're the son of two of the most famous people on this planet. You've been stuffed into newspapers and gossip magazines and then social media from the moment you were born. You have millions of followers online. People have watched you grow up entirely online. Did you really think no one was watching? I know I'm probably being a little cynical, and harsher than usual here, but as someone who comes from literally nothing and who has had to work for everything their entire lives, like, it bothers me when I see people like Brooklyn Beckham who are just handed stuff because of who their parents are, and they have no idea how lucky they are, and they take all these opportunities and then they just throw them away because they don't want to actually put the time and effort and hard work into something, you know? Textbook nepotism, and it annoys the hell out of me. Anyway, back to the main content of the book, and the majority of the book is arranged into pages filled with his photos and occasional captions, like this page, for example, which is just generic black and white shots of his family, with the caption, exploring. As you can see, these are very deep, very meaningful captions. Brooklyn put a lot of time and effort and thought into these. Oh my god. I can't even be sarcastic about this. It's... Or another generic page is this one, which is just like generic photos of his little brother by a pool, and then another shot of his feet. This provides no value or interest to anyone who is reading this book, unless you like shirtless little boys, in which case, please put down the book and get some help. But other than that, there is nothing you can get out of these photos. No enjoyment, no interest, no value, no... They're bland. And they're pointless. That said, I think one disadvantage I did have going into this book was that, one, it's just like a lot of like family photos of like, oh look, we went on this holiday together, we went to the park together, here's my dad's tattoos, here's my mum touching an elephant, you know, that sort of generic family stuff, and I don't really enjoy just staring at happy families for the sake of it, so, you know, that doesn't really do anything for me, it doesn't really interest me, I don't really care, so maybe I'm just not the right target audience for this book. Two, I don't really have any interest in watching rich people do rich people things, like fancy holidays and sitting by pools and going on photo shoots and stuff, so again, maybe I'm not the right target audience for this book. And three, I'm not really familiar with the Beckhams, and I didn't really recognise any of the people other than David and Victoria. Like, I don't know who any of the kids are, they're just generic kids to me, and then Brooklyn put a few of his friends in. I don't know if they're meant to be famous people or if they're just generic friends, I don't know, but again, I didn't know who any of these people were, I didn't care about them, I didn't get anything out of seeing them, so again, most of that didn't really mean anything to me either. I think calling this a photography book is a bit of a stretch. It's more like a Beckham family photo album or a printed Instagram feed. I think you need to be a big fan of the Beckhams personally to get anything out of this book, so again, maybe I'm just not the right target audience, and I'm aware of that. That said, it is marketed as a photography book for people who enjoy photography, which, you know, is someone like me. So I'm gonna review and judge based on that criteria, you know, what, like how I would review any other photography book, how I have reviewed other photography books, and so on. Overall, I put the photos in this book into three categories. The smallest one being the good, the largest one being the bad, and the third category, the selfies. The good, the bad, and the selfies. Let's talk about them. One of the first things I notice is that there is so little consistency to Brooklyn's work. He has no real consistent style, no real voice, no real point of view. I can't tell what he's trying to do with many of these photos. They kind of feel like, oh, I was just here and took a photo, done. You know, and that's kind of fine because he's a kid, he's still learning, he's finding his voice. But also, when you're at that stage, again, don't make a book. Simple as that. He also has absolutely no competency with basic photography techniques in so many of his photos. Most of the photos in this book are just bad. Like really bad. They're unintentionally out of focus, not correctly exposed. They lack any thoughtful composition, or they're just blurry and messy, or pointless, or... He lacks any basic competency at taking a photo. And now I'm not saying that every photo needs to be, you know, the focus needs to be here, the exposure needs to be this, it needs this. Like, I'm not saying every photo has to be technically perfect, but I guess a comparison that people might understand is look at Picasso's work. He mastered the basics and he became a competent painter before he then started breaking the rules and doing something a little different. He had to learn the rules to break them. Brooklyn doesn't know the rules in the first place, so he's not intentionally breaking them, he's just taking bad photos. He's not thinking, oh, I need to move the focus away from her face and to her elbow because there's a meaning there. He just doesn't know how to focus his camera. and that's a problem. And the annoying thing about this is that Brooklyn mentions in this book that he uses a Leica camera, and we see it in a fair few of his mirror selfies as well, and I still can't believe that's actually a sentence I'm saying. We see his Leica in his mirror selfies. For those of you who aren't familiar, Leica are probably the most expensive camera brand there is. They are high quality, they are good cameras. They're the kind of cameras that us amateur photographers can only dream of having or affording or owning at any point, or even just using one day. I used to think it would be impossible for anyone to take a bad photo with a Leica, but here we are. Brooklyn Beckham proved me wrong. So we can't excuse him getting the basics wrong, like having photos out of focus, or underexposed, or overexposed, or photos with a too long a shutter speed, or anything like that. We can't excuse that by saying, oh, he was working with poor kit. Oh, he was struggling with, like, an out-of-date camera. Oh, he had that. Like, no. This isn't a problem with cheap or poor quality kit. There's no excuse of this other than his lack of skill. There's no explanation for this other than his lack of skill. When I first started getting kind of serious about photography when I was like 15 or 16, my camera was this cheap, crappy Fujifilm bridge that was the only thing I could afford, that was a bit more advanced than a point and shoot, and it only had 2 aperture settings, which I think were like 5 point something and 8.6 and 8.4? I can't remember off the top of my head. But like, basically it had 2 aperture settings, and the low light performance was absolutely awful. You would get so much grain at like anything 800 and above. It had possibly the worst autofocus system in the world. It was so slow. Oh my god. I was struggling against it constantly, and for that reason it's no wonder my photos were kind of turning out like this, you know? But I was still learning, and I had the poor kit, and it just it was a whole thing. But I fought against that camera, I struggled with it, and I tamed it, and I started to get a little bit better and better and better despite my kit. So then when I was like 18 or 19 and I upgraded to a DSLR and I got my old trusty Canon 550D, that was a huge step up for me because I built up the skills with this crappy camera, and now I finally had the kit to match, and I was finally able to do what I'd been trying to do before. So we do have to acknowledge that sometimes people are limited by the kit they're using. That said, we also see people who take incredible, amazing photos with nothing more than an iPhone, with old film cameras, with crappy point and shoot cameras. There's, what was it now? There used to be a series on YouTube where they would get some of the best photographers in the world to use some of the worst cameras in the world and see what they could come up with. And there was a really, like, interesting one that sticks in my mind where they got, what was it now? I can't remember his name, but it was a guy who's known for shooting a lot of skateboarders, and they got him to use a Lego camera, literally a camera made from Lego, and it was like terrible quality. It was absolutely awful, and he still got some damn good photos with it because he had the eye, he had the skill, he knew what he was doing. Anyway, the point is sometimes we can excuse that, but we can't with Brooklyn Beckham. He has no excuse. His photos just end up looking like this because of his lack of skill, and it's an absolute joke. This photo here is one of the worst offenders in the entire book. He captions it, "Dinner. I like this picture." It's out of focus, but you can tell there's a lot going on. So clearly none of the things wrong with this photo were intentional. We know this from the caption. And a lot of people might look at this photo and say, yeah, it's blurry, so it's bad. But that's not the only thing wrong with it. There are so many things wrong with this photo. And funnily enough, it's not out of focus. It's not. The focus is fine. The focus isn't the problem. He's left his shutter speed open too long. That's why it's blurry. So again, he doesn't even know enough about photography to identify what's actually wrong with his pictures. But this one is a great example to start with to talk about some of the fundamentals of photography and what's wrong with this photo. So we're going to go through this step by step. I'm going to go right back to the basics for people who have never even looked into photography before, who don't know anything. I'm going to go step by step and talk about what is wrong with this picture, and also have a look at ways we might possibly be able to improve it slightly. Spoilers, we can't really, but I give it a go. So number one, let's start with this blur. This blur is not because the photo is out of focus. This blur is because he used a shutter speed that was far too long. The longer a shutter remains open, the more light gets in, but also if you're moving your camera at all, it will capture that movement as well. That's what happened here. So when you take a photograph, three main factors contribute to the exposure. And when I talk about exposure, very, very simply, that's how light or dark the image looks. So the three factors that mostly contribute to that are shutter speed, which is how long the shutter in front of the camera, how long that is open for. Obviously, the longer it's open, the more light it lets in, but also that means you're going to capture movements and things like that if it's open for a long time. Second is the aperture size, which is how big the hole in the front of the camera or lens opens to let the light in. The wider the hole, the more light gets let in, but also the narrower the distance in front of the camera is in focus. And obviously, the smaller the aperture is, the less light gets in, but the wider the area in front of the camera is in focus. We call this area in focus the depth of field, and we measure aperture size in something called f-stops, where, slightly confusingly, the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. So an f1.4 aperture is open really, really wide, but you get only, for example, a narrow area in focus. Whereas an f10 aperture, for example, is a lot smaller. So you'll have an f1.4, f10, f22. It gets tinier and tinier as it goes down. And when you have an f10, you have a wider area that's in focus. But obviously, less light is being let in. And finally, the third factor contributing to exposure is the sensitivity to light of the medium capturing the photo. So if you're shooting digital, like most people do these days, that is the sensitivity of the camera sensor, the digital sensor. And this level of sensitivity is referred to as ISO, and you'll see it in numbers like 100, 200, 400, all the way up to big numbers, 3200, 6400, and so on. The higher the number, the more sensitive to light it is, and therefore essentially the brighter your picture, but also the grainier your image will be. If you're shooting film, on the other hand, this is the sensitivity of the film itself to light, and this is measured in ASA. And again, you have the same numbers, and you can kind of make a rough comparison. So a film with an ASA of 100 will be roughly the same as a camera with an ISO of 100. And again, you'll see the same values in film, 100, 200, 400, so on. Again, the higher the number, the more sensitive the film, but also the more grain will be on your final image. So in order to expose an image correctly, you need to be working in a balance between the shutter speed, the aperture size, and the ISO or ASA. So when you're shooting in low light, like Brooklyn clearly was here, or like I do when I shoot gigs, because there's not a lot of light going on there, you need to think about how to properly expose your photos. How do you balance these three factors? Because the light's so low, you'll probably need to increase your ISO. You'll want to widen your aperture size. And yes, you can increase your shutter speed a little bit, but not to the point where it blurs motion like this. To compensate from having to use a lower shutter speed in low light, you make your aperture bigger, you boost your ISO. That's how you do this. You don't leave your shutter open for longer, because that's how you get blur and camera shake like this. Brooklyn didn't get his balance correct. He left his shutter open for too long, and that's why his photo ended up blurry. These fundamentals of exposure and understanding what camera settings do and how they work is literally the fundamental of photography. If you can't get this right, you're not going to be able to do anything else. You need to understand how a camera works and how to just properly take a photo before you can do anything else. If you can't get these fundamentals right, these basic skills right, stop calling yourself a photographer. Brooklyn. So let's imagine he takes this photo again and he has a faster shutter speed and you don't get this blur. Would it be a good photo then? Still no. Reason number 2 this is not a good photo is that look at all these perspective lines going on. This is a wonky photo with lines going everywhere. Nothing's lined up and it just looks wrong and wonky and awkward. Wonky horizons are one of my biggest personal pet peeves in photography, and Brooklyn is absolutely terrible for doing this in so much of his work. To me, a wonky horizon, not done on purpose, just screams laziness or just lack of really looking at your photos and bothering to take time with them. Sure, it's really hard to get your horizon straight off the camera, straight away when you're taking the picture, but there are things you can do to help with this. Like some cameras or rather some tripods, come with little spirit levels so you can make sure things are straight when you're taking the picture. Some cameras have little graphics on screen that'll tell you how wonky the camera is, so you can line things up with the line on the camera to make sure things are straight. But honestly, the most obvious thing to do is just fix it in post, you know? Straighten up that horizon, tilt your image, do some cropping, sort it out that way. This is why we have post-processing software. And a person who clearly has access to these tools and chooses to leave their horizons wonky for no good reason just annoys the hell out of me. Brooklyn clearly has access to all the things he could ever need or want. Money is not an issue for this guy. So the fact that he's leaving these things like this and not doing anything about it screams laziness or incompetency, or just he doesn't care about his art. Now, I'm not saying all photos have to be taken perfectly straight on, that's not what I'm saying at all. There are obviously times when you want to use an angle to, you know, show a different perspective or make something look bigger or smaller or, you know, change how you see it. You're doing it for an artistic purpose. An example off the top of my head would be when I was in Paris, I took this Polaroid of the Sacré-Cœur, and Polaroid's difficult because there's no post-processing with them, there's no editing, they're printed straight off the camera there and then, so you have to try and get it right. So I wanted to try and take this photo of one of the towers at the back at an angle to try and make it look taller, try and like really show how big and tall and imposing it was and how kind of small I felt next to it. So I chose to shoot it at this angle, and do you know how long I spent trying to get that wall of the tower parallel with what would be the side of the film? It's still not perfect, but that took some doing. So this is a photo with a purposely wonky angle, but I've still kept all my lines straight. It's still parallel with the edges of the frame. Compare that to like Brooklyn's photo here, and I popped some lines on this to show you all these leading lines go all over the place. Look at the Sacré-Cœur photo and how the lines flow up into the top corner. It leads your eye to the top of the tower. It shows you where you're looking. You feel small, the tower feels big. Compare it to this, where all these lines going over the place and none of them line up and none of them are parallel. There's all these angles. It's bad. This is done without purpose, and it makes the whole photo look lazy, unintentional. It throws off everything about this photo. You feel like you're kind of stood at an angle, you're getting a lot of lens distortions as well, you get this like really awkward distorted perspective, you don't really know where to look, your eye isn't drawn anywhere in particular into this painting, you're just all over the place, you feel off balance and not in a good way. It's very jarring, it's very confusing, it's very amateurish. So the first thing I tried to do to kind of fix this photo a little bit was to just try and straighten it up a bit. I used some guides in Lightroom, and it's not perfect, but it's better than it was. Just as a side-by-side comparison, here's the before and after. That said, still not a good photo, and now we come on to point 3. It's not good because there is so much wasted space in this photo. Now, empty space in photography can be a really powerful tool. We often call it negative space, and it can be a fantastic thing to do. You don't want your photos necessarily to be overcrowded sometimes. Having a lot of negative space can give the subject room to breathe. It could be like, if it's a moving object, you might want to use negative space as a way to signify that the object's going to move into this space. It creates motion. It kind of, you know, shows the movement of an object. It makes it feel more alive. Negative space can draw your focus to a specific part of the image and create meaning that way. It can be very important to make sure, like I say, your photo isn't overcrowded and confusing and overwhelming for the viewer. But what you have in this photo of Brooklyn's, that I'm just going to highlight these empty spaces, they're not negative space. They're just empty spaces that serve no purpose. And they don't draw your eye to anything in particular. In fact, they kind of distract you from what I think should be the focus. But there's nothing there, so it's like, why? What's the point? It's boring. And for that reason, like, pair that with the busy texture you have going on the ceiling, which again is all wonky and all over the place. Like, it's distracting. Pair that again with the empty seats at the very front of the image, which again, they're distracting. Your eye is drawn straight to that and it takes you away from everything else going on. I feel like the focus should be on the people eating at the table, and it's not, because your eye is going all over the image to all the places that it shouldn't. So if this was my photo, I would have zoomed in further, I would have got closer, I would have got rid of some of that empty, useless space. I'd have definitely cropped out those empty plates and places on that table at the front, because you do not need them in there. It is distracting. If I couldn't manually do it by getting closer or zooming, I would have cropped in post-processing, and that's what I tried to do here in Lightroom. I played around with a few crops of this. Honestly, I was struggling with it a bit. It's still not right, it's still off. Eventually I settled with this. It was kind of the best I could do. I'm not overly happy with it though. I did keep some of this empty space from this white wall, but got rid of the black empty space. I felt having this negative space of the white wall did kind of help draw your eye down towards the end of the table a little bit, kind of taking you on a journey, taking you through the story, but it's still not perfect, it's still not great. There is this rule in photography when it comes to composition called the rule of thirds, and if you want to find out more about it, I'll leave a link in the video description. But basically, you use the rule of thirds to create interesting and balanced compositions. And the very, very basic rule is you want to position important parts of your photo either towards the upper or lower third, or left or right third, or the intersecting points on an image. Just because it's quite aesthetically pleasing, it creates a nice balance, it's interesting, it draws your eye in. So I tried to kind of like play around with this a bit when cropping this photo. I've kind of imposed a grid over this, and excuse my terrible arrows drawn on this, but what I was trying to do was like, I cropped it so your eye was sort of drawn upwards towards the top right section of this image, your eye sort of drawn in, down, but it's hard to do with the photo because the photo wasn't good to begin with. The fourth problem with this image is that there's just no real contrast or texture or anything interesting going on in this photo, and that's so important to have when you're shooting black and white. Contrast is so important. Generally, it can mean you want the darkest areas of your photos to be dark, dark black, and the lightest areas to be bright, bright white. But mostly it just means you want to create a real distinction between areas, make one area stand out from another. If you don't have good contrast, you end up with an image like this, which is bland and grey and washed out, and everything's just kind of a bit murky and wishy-washy, and everything's just like meh, you know? Contrast is important for showing the important or focal parts of the image, making the subject stand out, creating an interesting image. Contrast is important for like playing around with the composition and showing you where your eye needs to travel to and so on. Brooklyn's image and all his black and white images are just very, very grey. They don't work. Even the uncropped version of this image, which had some darker areas, they weren't dark, they were just grey. His white areas were just lighter grey. There was no black and white. So I tried to kind of bring a little more contrast to this image. I think maybe I overdid it. I think my dark areas are too dark, there's not enough detail in them, but it's hard when you're playing around with compressed JPEGs and rather than like the original RAW files. But it's not great, but it's just a little bit of an improvement, I guess. Yeah. Point is, I would have liked to have seen more contrast in his image. In all his images, actually. Well, not all of them. In his black and white images, definitely. And now on to problem 5. Of course, there are some problems that can't be fixed in post-processing that this photo is just stuck with. And a lot of that comes down to how he actually shot it. I wish he'd moved his shot. I wish he'd done something different. So, where is the focus actually meant to be in this image? What are we looking at here? What are we trying to concentrate on? I'm guessing he wants to show like the hustle and bustle of this party. He wants to make it look fun and exciting and dynamic rather than a half-empty room where people look bored, as the original does, you know? So if this was me taking this photo, I'd have used a narrow depth of field, so wide aperture, and I'd focused right at the far end of the table. I'd have crouched down, I'd have come down a little lower to be on eye level with the people at the table. And I'd also get a little bit closer, so by cutting out those empty places like at the end of the table, and also I'd like the table to come down and kind of meet the bottom corners of the photograph, and so you kind of create a sort of tunnel going down the table. You're looking down into it, you're traveling down the table, and it starts off blurry up close and it gets more and more in focus as you go down towards the end of the table. This would create a party that looks fun and dynamic and happy and busy, and it tells a story, and you go on this journey down the photograph. That's what I would have done, but this is one of those things that you can't fix in post-processing. You have to do it when you're there taking the photo, you know? Other tiny minor details as well, like I'd have waited a few moments for these people who are stood up to sit down or move, because they're just awkward distractions at the moment. They distract from whatever's going on. They make your eye dart around the photo in an awkward way. Yeah, it's not great. Just wait a few minutes. That's all you need to do. Just wait and then take your photo. Probably one of the biggest parts of photography is knowing when to take the photo, and it is okay to stand and wait for a few minutes for your perfect shot. Brooklyn doesn't seem to have done this. It's like he was standing up and just go, oh, take a picture, gone. Like he didn't even review it before he left. He just done, gone. None of this feels intentional. It feels very lazy, and it bothers me. Now, obviously, you don't always have a chance to stand around and wait for the perfect shot in certain types of photography. If you're doing photojournalism, if you're doing street photography, or when I'm shooting gigs, there's no time to stand around and wait, which is why you have to get good at knowing when to take photos. You have to get good at kind of guessing what's going to happen next, if that makes sense. Understanding how do bands act, what's likely to be happening on stage, where are they likely to move, how do they interact with each other. You have to always be ready to get your shot. You need to be fast, and you need to take the opportunities when you can. Look for the moments that the lighting is going to be in the right place, when the band are interacting with each other, when something important is going to happen, like a singer comes out to the front of the stage or interacts with the crowd or stage dives, you know. Watch everything closely and try to second guess the artist's moves before they do them, and then be there ready and waiting to get the shot. That sort of thing though only comes with practice and experience and, you know, going to gig after gig after gig after gig. But when you're taking a shot like this, where you do have time to stand around and wait and set up your shot and be like, hang on, this is what I want to do, this is how I'm going to try and capture it. When you do have the time, why wouldn't you just wait for them to sit down or move, other than laziness? So that's a lot of things, but not quite everything wrong with this photograph by Brooklyn Beckham, and hopefully that should give you a good foundation to understand what a few of my next critiques are based on. All this said, this isn't the only time when Brooklyn Beckham messes up his shutter speed and ends up with blurry photos unintentionally. He actually does this again and again and again and again throughout this book. This is what I mean. He doesn't have any of these fundamental skills down. He can't do any of this. There's this set he does where he tries to like photograph his dad's tattoos, and it's like a 2-page spread, and some of them are okay, they're fine, not really anything special. Here's one of the spreads. They look a lot like the photos my tattoo artist took of me when I got my tattoo of Kyra's ears done. It's that kind of setup, just very generic, showing off the ink, okay, cool, done, move on. There's nothing really artistic about these, they're just, I don't know, they document his tattoos, I guess. In terms of artistic ability, I don't really see any. It's funny though, because I'm not really a portrait photographer, like a studio portrait photographer myself, but I've been trying to get better at it. So 2 years ago now, I wanted a year and a half, 2 years, sometime over the last 2 years, I've been attempting a series of black and white portraits on myself, like self-portraits that are focused on close-up body parts, so hands, collarbones, the protruding bones on my back that I used to get mocked for. And I did these in black and white, and I was interested to see how these small, overlooked parts of my body made up the whole of me in general. So I played around with like a narrow depth of field, lots of contrast. I wanted to try and pick up lots of skin texture, that kind of thing. And over a couple of different shots, I ended up with these images. They're not brilliant because, like I say, portraits like this aren't my speciality, but it's still a skill that I'm learning. And I would argue that these photos are more interesting than the poorly composed and weirdly cropped similar images by Brooklyn. I don't know, I feel weird comparing my own work to his and being like, oh, mine's better, but I hope it is. I feel like it is. Anyway, not the point. These aren't really the photos I want to complain about that much. They're generic, but at least they're competent. My issue is with his other tattoo spread, where the giant photo here, How do you mess up such a simple photo this badly? Again, one, shutter speed is too long. It's blurry. And this looks to be fairly decent lighting, so there's no excuse really. And why didn't you take another one? Two, the composition. What is this? Like, he clearly had the idea for something cool happening here, right? And this could have gone so well. So clearly what he wanted to do was this symmetrical shot with David holding up two fists and his face being kind of in the background between them, right? He had this idea, he was gonna do it, and then he just thought, nah, I don't actually need to set that up, do I? I'll just snap this, it's fine, they'll get the idea anyway. It's lazy. Just move a little to the side so the fists are symmetrical and properly lined up in front of the camera. Make David more centered, make his face more centered, and the way he's holding his fists, make them more symmetrical, make them actually frame the face, you know? I also have kind of issues with the exposure of this photo and the depth of field and what's going on here. I think we either need a wider depth of field so we can see more detail in David's face and get both the face and hands in focus, or we need a much narrower depth of field so his face is more completely blurred. As it stands, the face is at this awkward, slightly in focus, slightly not sort of state where you can recognise it at David Beckham, but you can't see enough details to make it interesting. So it just ends up being a bit of a distraction from the fists, you know? Your eye doesn't quite know where it's supposed to be focusing. Is it on the blurry face or is it on the hands? I don't know. That said, if you're not gonna have the face in focus, then I want it to be a little darker. I want the face to be a little underexposed while the fists and hands are properly lit and they're the brightest part of the image. At the minute, the face is just as bright as the hands near enough. Well, not quite, it's a little bit darker, but it's still very bright and it's very distracting. And again, your eye is drawn to this blurry face and it detracts from the attention. So I'd like the face a little darker, I'd like the chest a little darker, and I'd like them to just move a little bit so there isn't this giant stripe of shadow across the chest, which is just very, very distracting. It needs to go. Either have it all in shadow or none of it in shadow. And for all I'm complaining about Brooklyn not understanding the fundamentals of photography and not knowing how to use his camera and not being able to like properly expose an image and stuff like that, clearly he knows what shutter speed is because he's experimented with it and played around with longer exposures in some of his photos like these. And you know, these are kind of cool. These are examples of how longer shutter speeds can be useful in photography. Sometimes you want the shutter open for longer to track a movement of some kind. It can be really, really effective. For example, I've used longer shutter speeds when I've been trying to capture fire trails when doing steel wool photography, to capture traffic movements, God, years back now when I lived in Brighton, or to capture flowing water like in these shots I took in Harrogate. The longer shutter speed captures the motion, and if you use a tripod or rest your camera on something still, all the still elements will remain sharp and in focus, but the moving water will look flowy and soft, and it's a really beautiful technique. Using longer shutter speeds can create some really cool effects, and I actually commend Brooklyn here for trying this out, and his shots here look very similar to what mine did at this age when I was first experimenting with longer shutter speeds and photography like this, so I have no major complaints about these photos in general. He's a kid playing around with a camera and I think it's a really cool, fun thing to see. My only complaint is they shouldn't be in a book that people pay for. These are your experimental shots. These are you trying stuff out. These are you learning. You don't sell these to people. My other complaint is that he didn't need to include all 5 photos in this book. Seeing 5 mediocre shots doesn't impress me more than seeing one good one. If he just included one of these, maybe the 4th one, which I think is the best, if he just included this one, then I probably wouldn't be as critical, because I wouldn't see all these other mediocre attempts in there as well. I used to work with this really, really excellent photographer called Stuart Randall, and fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Mostly he shot weddings, and his photos were just beautiful. Now though, he owns and works with Folio Albums, who make these absolutely beautiful, bespoke, handmade, high quality photography albums, mostly wedding albums. He works directly with professional photographers. I worked there for a while as well, and Yeah, so I met him when I was like 14 or so, because me and my sister used to print his photos for him. He was really impressed with the stuff we did. And then again, I worked for him when I was 19 for a little bit at Folio Albums. And while I was working for him, he taught me a hell of a lot because he knew I was interested in photography. And he used to drive me home from work quite a bit and he'd give me all this advice. The best piece of advice he gave me that really, really stuck with me, that I still use today, was simply edit in, don't edit out. And what that means is when you get back from a big shoot, you'll have hundreds, if not thousands of photographs, right? And when you're going through them, it's so easy to look at them all and be like, okay, this is bad, delete. This is bad, delete. And then you end up with a collection of still a few hundred to 1,000 images that are average to good. But when you edit out like that, when you just get rid of the worst ones and you leave all the rest, that's how you end up with mediocre photos like these ones that Brooklyn took in collections like this, because he's edited out, not edited in, if he's edited at all. Instead, when you edit in, it means you learn to be very brutal with your own work. You need to be your harshest critic. And instead of saying, this isn't good enough, delete, you go through your work and say, this one's perfect, keep. This one's perfect, keep. And you discard all the rest. You discard everything that isn't the best. It means you end up with far fewer photos overall from a shoot, but the ones you do keep are of much higher quality. It's far more this is what I've always said about everything from like poetry books to mostly poetry books on this channel, that's how I've spoken about it, but it's better to end up with, for example, 5 really high quality, perfect, really stunning photographs than 100 mediocre ones. It really, really is. When he first told me this, it was like a little light bulb going on in my head and I was like, oh, why have I not approached it this way before? You know, once I changed that mindset and I started editing in, not out, I quickly noticed an increase in the quality of my work, and that there ended up being more good shots per shoot than before, because it meant I was being harsher on myself. It meant I was raising my standards. It meant I wasn't settling for mediocrity, and it made me think more critically about my work, what was good enough, what wasn't, and how I needed to improve, and I still do that to this day. Sadly, there are just so many instances of Brooklyn not doing this throughout this book. Like, to give you a few more examples, these shots here. These are actually pretty decent for him. Not all of them, a few are blurry, again, too long a shutter speed. He cannot shoot in low light to save his life. But yeah, on the whole, pretty decent. But he didn't need to include all 4. Pick one. That's all I needed to see. One of these photos, printed largely, or small if you want, but one on its own would be far more impactful than 4 of basically the same photo with varying degrees of mediocrity. Or these photos here in this park. You don't need to include all 8. Not at all. You could argue with photos like these that he's trying to tell a story here. That would be one reason to include a set like this, but these are all so similar. There's no narrative, nothing changes, there's no action. They're all just very generic, so you don't need them all. Pick one. That's all you need to do. Also, these photos annoy the hell out of me because, mate, again, straighten your horizon, center your subject, use that path as leading lines to guide your viewer's eye towards your family, and also learn what contrast is. Again, so grey, so dull, so bland. Oh, it's horrific. These photos actually remind me a hell of a lot of some photos I took about 8 years ago now when I was in Berlin, and we were walking down this path towards Charlottenburg Palace, and I was trying to get this photo of the path like leading down to the palace building with the trees sort of framing it either side, and this is the photo I eventually got. It's still off. It's still not centered properly, and look at the space between the sides of the tower and the trees. Little differences, but the lack of symmetry there still annoys the hell out of me to this day, 8 years on. Anyway, this is the photo I was trying to get. Didn't quite manage to pull it off, but I did pull off another one that I really like, that I kind of prefer. As I was trying to get this shot, there was this little old couple in front of us, and they were just like pottering along together, and they were so sweet. They were making each other laugh. They were really, really cute. And I saw them and I was like, I want to get a photo of this. So I stepped to the side, sort of off center, and I positioned the couple in this right 1/3 of my frame, right down where that 1/3 kind of like, you know, dividing line would be essentially. I got up on my tiptoes to try and get the right angle for the shot because I wanted to position the palace just above their heads, and I wanted the path to kind of come down as best I could into the corners of my photograph. Again, still a little bit off, didn't quite pull it off perfectly, but you know, it's not a perfect shot, like I say. I can see a lot of ways I could have improved this to this day, but I still think it's a nice example of how a shot like this can tell a story. The positioning of the couple, the way the path guides the viewer down towards the palace. Because I also played around with the exposure, this was kind of important here. The palace is quite bright and white, the trees in the middle are dark, and then the couple is a little brighter in the front. You get a very distinctive background, mid, foreground, you know? And it tells a story, it guides the viewer. You see this little couple, you see where they're going, it takes you on a journey, and that's what I was trying to do with this. And this is what Brooklyn could have potentially done with these photos of his family, but doesn't quite know how to yet. I think maybe, I don't know if it's that he lacks the skill to do it, or that he lacks the understanding to do it. Does that make sense? Like, maybe he doesn't quite know what makes a good photograph because he hasn't studied the photography of others, of other good photographers. I'm not sure if he'd even know the other photographers that he got compared to in that review. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen, like, Lee Miller I'm only a little bit familiar with, but Nan Golding, fantastic, iconic. But like I say, I don't know if Brooklyn would know who they are, or what makes them good photographers, or what makes their work good. And without that, I feel like maybe he can't apply the same critiques to his own photography because he doesn't really know what he's looking for. I don't know. Anyway, now I want to quickly address the photos which got turned into a meme, which is how I first found this book in the first place. Elephants in Kenya. So hard to photograph, but incredible to see. Now, I'm gonna have to take your word for that, Brooklyn, because I can't even see an elephant in this photo. Oh god, it's so bad. How did this get published? How? Oh. This is just the biggest rookie mistake that there is. He's shooting something in the shade against a bright, backlit backdrop. It's a challenge for anyone, even people who have been photographing decades, you know? This is hard. But there are a couple of options for what you can do here. Most of them involve deleting this photo and learning from your mistakes, but, you know. First option is retake the photograph and expose for the elephant, which means we'll see all the details on the elephant, but the background itself will be extremely overexposed, maybe looking pure white. But the elephant is the focus, expose for the object that your focus is on, not for their background. The second option is to, again, retake the photo, but this time use a flash. So the flash will light up the foreground and show us the details on the elephant and properly expose the elephant, but the flash won't reach the background, which is already lit. So the background will be exposed by the natural sunlight, the elephant will be lit up by the flash. Does that make sense? So you'll get both the elephant and hopefully the background both perfectly exposed because you're using two different light sources to light two different areas. Now, this would work, but sometimes it can look a little bit weird and cause problems. It can cause shadows to go in unexpected places, it can wipe out shadows altogether, it can just look a bit silly because sometimes it looks like you've taken two separate photos and literally cut one out and pasted it on top of the other. It can look unnatural. Sometimes we see things with these two light sources and our eyes and brains just like, that looks wrong. It can be quite uncanny. Thirdly, you could just move or wait until the elephant is out of the shade or the sun isn't directly behind him. You know, that's an option too. Knowing when to take the shot is just as important as getting a shot. Or the fourth and final option would be to see if you can save this photograph in post-processing. If you shoot in a file format like RAW, your files will contain a lot more information, there'll be no compression, and you'll actually be able to do a lot more with them when it comes to editing. So, as an example, here's a photo that I took on my recent trip to Paris. So we were walking towards Pont Neuf at sunset, and we got to the park, and the sky was so beautiful. This gorgeous, gorgeous sunset. The sky's lit up all these colours, but the park itself was already quite dark, and it was very poorly lit. But I was like, challenge myself here, let's see what we can do. So I always shoot in RAW, and I took a photo of this park, which I exposed for the sky. I wanted the sky to be the focus. I wanted to capture all the details mostly in the sky. So I exposed for the sky. And as you can see from the original plain unedited image, this isn't a good photo. It's dark, it's dull, everything looks washed out, you can see no details. But because I have experience, because I've been doing this a long time, I knew I could fix this in Lightroom. Here's a discussion point for you, because I know some kind of slightly more elitist people think, no, your photo needs to be perfect straight from the camera, but it rarely is. It's so hard to get a photo perfect off the camera. Most cameras don't have the ability to capture the dynamic range that the human eye can. So we need to work to pull certain bits back in post-processing to recreate what we see in front of us sometimes. You can't always capture exactly what you want straight from the camera. So editing is just as an important part of photography as actually taking the image. And sometimes you do have to think ahead and think, okay, so I'm gonna shoot like X, Y, and Z so I can do A, B, and C edits later to get this result that I want and get the best photo possible. And this is even true of analog photography. Editing isn't just a recent thing. It's not just a Photoshop and Lightroom thing. It's not a new thing. Photo editing has been done for as long as there's been photos, you know? There are lots of things you can do when it comes to the developing process to change the outcome of your photos and the printing process. You can cross-process your films, which means you develop them in different chemicals than they were designed for to create different coloured effects and stuff like that. Obviously this won't work for all of them. Don't go shoving a black and white film in C41 chemicals. Nothing will happen, it'll be a mess, you'll ruin a film, you know, so don't do stuff like that. But you can use different chemicals, you can develop for different lengths of time, you can use different printing techniques, you can do all sorts of different stuff on an enlarger. Basically, you can get lots of different outcomes even when you're shooting with an analog format. But anyway, back to this photo. You can see it sucks until we work a little bit of magic. We take the exposure controls and we brighten the whole image a little bit, and then we especially brighten the shadows. We darken the highlights a little to bring out the sky a bit more. We increase the overall vibrancy and saturation to really capture the bold colours of the sky as it was in real life. We're not trying to create something mythical or fantasy-like here. We're just trying to recreate on the photo how it looked in person, you know? Then we can use these clarity and dehaze sliders to really bring out the details in these dark areas a little bit more. And the latest version of Lightroom has some really powerful masking tools, so you can use this tool here to just pick out the sky, darken that a little bit, lower the exposure of the sky without messing up the rest of the park. And you can do some other things. I always like to make sure my photos are nice and straight. I like to add a little vignette to my images, but that's more of a personal preference than anything else. And because I shot this image with quite a high ISO, you can see it's a little grainy, a little noisy, so you can reduce some of that grain in Lightroom using those tools as well. And here's the final photo as I edited it. Big difference, big improvement. This kind of editing is a skill that Brooklyn Beckham clearly needs to learn. Now obviously I don't have the raw version of Brooklyn's photograph to play with. All I have is this super tiny, really low quality, compressed the hell out of version that I cropped from the digital version of this book. It is a very poor quality file, but I decided to see if there was anything I could do with this image in Lightroom. And here's what I did. And oh my god, look, there is actually an elephant in this photo after all. Huh, you know what, say what you want about Brooklyn Beckham, but he's not a liar. There was an elephant in this photo. But yeah, already a million times better. Still not a great photo, obviously the quality is terrible, but you can see his background was overexposed, his elephant was underexposed, and by doing a little bit of editing and playing around in Lightroom, we can darken that background, brighten the shadows, bring out that elephant a little bit more, and make it a little bit more balanced. Now, while this is the photo that seems to get all the attention online and with the memes, and it's obvious why, the caption, the image, it's funny. It's funny as hell. But it's not his only bad elephant photo. Here's one which is also out of focus, not brilliantly framed, and has the wonky horizon, and is also underexposed. So much wrong with this one. It's annoying. And then we get this page here which has another bland, low contrast attempt at a black and white shot, where from a distance this actually looks okay, it's not too bad. And then you zoom in and you realise that the focus is completely off. It's not where it should be. The focus isn't on the elephant, it's not on Victoria's face, it's not on Victoria's hands, it's on her elbow. Her elbow is the only part of this photo actually in focus. It's so bad. And then we have a few, again, basic composition rules that are just sort of being ignored here. Awkwardly cutting off the top of her head, the man in the background where they've cut off, again, an awkward portion of him. Not enough that he's like fully in the background and ignorable, but also too much that he's like a main part of the image. Like, it's not good, it's bad. Cutting off the elephant's ear so much, not great. Honestly though, this is probably the best of the elephant shots, even with the focus on the elbow, because at least the composition in general is pretty decent. He's attempted to use this rule of thirds here, he just hasn't quite pulled it off. But all elbow jokes aside, I'm not as angry about this photo as I'm about some of them. It's not the worst by far. My next criticism is focused on wonky horizons, and there are so many in this book. So many! Too many! And they are a pet peeve of mine. I've said this before, they bother me. This is one of the first images in the book, and it's very big, very obvious, and it annoys me. It annoys me so much. And again, there are so many things wrong with this photo, not just the wonky horizon. When you're shooting a landscape shot, you want to narrow your aperture as much as possible to get as wide a depth of field as possible, to get as much detail over a long distance as you can. Brooklyn hasn't done this here. So in this shot, the hills in the background actually look really, really blurry. The water's slightly in focus, but the main focus here is on this fence. And you don't want that. You want the main focus to probably be on the hills and to be on the water, and then the fence to be slightly out of focus in the foreground. Now, there are other reasons why you might want the fence in foreground and the background not, if you're doing something artistic and creative and whatever. But in this shot, there's no reason for the fence to be the only thing in focus. It just doesn't work. It adds nothing, it's not an interesting perspective, it's just poor skills, you know? So what I would do with this is straighten that horizon, make the sky more dynamic and interesting in editing. And why did he choose black and white for this shot? It adds nothing. With all those shades of green and blue and brown, this photo just ends up looking bland and grey and washed out. No contrast at all. Dull, plain, boring. I find it very difficult to care about anything in this photo, to be honest. But I did a little bit of editing with this to see if we could kind of pull it back at all and create anything out of it. Straightened up the horizon, and then suddenly the slope of the fence started to feel a little more interesting to me. I don't know, I didn't hate it. I added some more contrast to basically everywhere, but especially the sky. I really tried to bring out the choppier textures of the water. I also cropped it to get rid of some of that boring grass texture that's dominating the bottom and just distracting you from the interesting bits. And I wanted the whole image to kind of fit more into whole rule of thirds a bit, so you have like sky, water, foreground. That's what I wanted in the thirds. Again, not perfect, still doesn't come out looking a good photo, but it's a little better, you know? Honestly, I still think this is a photo, if this was my collection, this is one of the ones I would leave out altogether. Honestly, if I had to put a collection together of his photographs, I could maybe pick out 20 decent ones from this 300 photograph collection, but you know. Yeah, so this image, it's okay, it's not bad, but I don't think it would make the final cut for me. Definitely not good enough to be a whole 2-page spread like this one is. Next up are two more of almost the same photograph, complete with no contrast, washed out greys, boring subject, no thought put into composition, and possibly the wonkiest and most annoying horizon in this book. I hate this. The thing is though, not all Brooklyn's horizons look like this. He proves he can actually pull off a straight horizon, or near enough anyway, in this photo of Coney Island. I love it, this is great. You can do it here, why not do it in the others? I actually think this is a really good shot, you know? While the sky's a little washed out and a little grey, I actually really like the contrast he has going on with the people in the foreground in the water. I think the whole shot tells a story, composition is pretty good. this is a decent shot. I actually really like this. Sadly, his other Coney Island shots just don't really hold up for me. Some of his portraits are okay-ish, but kind of forgettable. And then others like this are just like, eh. The carousel one seems both too saturated and yet washed out in the dark areas at the same time. It's very odd. I don't really know what he's done with it, but it just doesn't work for me. And the composition feels unbalanced. The horse's head is too close to the top of the shot, with too much empty and wasted space at the bottom. It feels unbalanced. There's no movement, there's no joy in it. Yeah. And the black and white one for the fairground. Again, it doesn't really say Coney Island to me. If he hadn't labelled it as Coney Island, I don't think I'd have recognised it. It doesn't capture the fun, the spirit, the busyness, the excitement, none of that. It's just kind of bland, you know? It looks more like an abandoned theme park than Coney Island itself. As a bit of a comparison, I was in Coney Island like 7 years ago now, and while my photos aren't perfect, I think they have a very, very different feel to Brooklyn's attempts. Now, if I could go back there today with the skills I've developed since, there's definitely a lot I would change about these photos. Some of the composition's a little off. They were a little rushed, to be honest. I'd love to go back now with a tripod and really try some of these long exposures again. I do think it's important to acknowledge that I was an advantage over Brooklyn in that I was shooting at sunset, so that did add a lot to my photographs where Brooklyn didn't have that. But when you compare these, which have like, you know, they've got movement and fun and excitement and it's thrilling, compare it to Brooklyn's black and white shot, and that just feels a little lifeless and still and lacking atmosphere for my tastes. But again, I know it's just a personal preference. Like I say, my photos are far, far from perfect, especially with this last one. Oh, annoys me. I just want to like scream at my past self, no, stop it, take a step to the left, don't cut off that far side of the ride, and do you really need the fence there? Surely you could have just, you know, lifted the camera up, gone a bit, Anyway, I have many criticisms of my own work. Many. But at least I think these capture the thrill and excitement and fun of Coney Island. Like I say, I think if Brooklyn hadn't labelled this as Coney Island, I wouldn't have immediately recognised that that's where it was. Other photos of his look like they came straight off an old Myspace profile, but not in the like, oh my god, nostalgia, am I right kind of way, but more in the like, oh god, have we not grown out of this yet kind of way. Here are some shoes. Here's someone, maybe Brooklyn, with a kiss on their cheek and too much flash used. Here's some over-exaggerated close-up shots of the floor with a narrow depth of field. Oh, and it's been raining, so you know how sad and deep and complicated he is. Hashtag emo for life. Look, everyone took these kinds of photos when they were starting out with the camera and getting into photography. It's part of the learning process when you're an angsty teenager, I get that. But again, these are your practice shots. These aren't the ones you publish in a book, you know? And then we get to the selfies. He even goes as far as to fill whole pages of this book with mirror selfies taken on his phone. I wish I was making this up. Why did I pay money for this? Seriously, like, depending on who buys and what country they're from, I am going to need to sell between 5 and 9 copies of my own book to make the money back that I spent on this. I feel sad. But it's okay. Not all of his selfies are mirror selfies taken on his phone. Some are mirror selfies taken with his Leica. Seriously, a Leica being used to take mirror selfies is just the epitome of privileged white boy, isn't it? Here's a page of what I thought were 4 of the same selfie, but it's actually not. If you look really closely, the position of his hand holding the lens steady actually changes a little tiny bit with each photograph. We are truly witnessing art here. Cindy Sherman could never. Here's an ad for his mum's sunglasses. I mean, another super deep and important self-portrait, sorry. Always getting those two mixed up. This one's like super artistic because he's sat on the floor and he's covering his face, which is very different to this one where he stood up and covering his face while being entirely out of focus because like reasons and stuff. Like Brooklyn's art is just so deep that if this doesn't speak to you, if you don't connect with this, it's because you're not an intellectual like he is. He is a true artist, okay? This is just like what he sees. Why don't you get it? And then in this book of Brooklyn Beckham's photography, we get the photos that weren't even taken by him, but they are of him at least. Here he is on a balcony. Here he is in a jacket. Here he is with a dog. How did this get published? How? But all snark aside, to end on a positive note, here are a few good photos taken by Brooklyn. This one is apparently from a Kanye concert, and well, you can't really see anything happening on stage. I assume it's pointed at a stage, I don't know. I still like it. I do like this. It's atmospheric, the colours are nice, I like the composition. That's pretty much spot on. You've got the symmetry, you've got the leading lines. It's really good. I have no complaints. I mean, it's a Kanye concert, so that's a bit of a complaint, but other than that, I actually kind of like this. I think it's good. Same with this image here that he has of, I think it's a Clinton rally, something like that. Again, all politics aside, pretty good photo. I love how the focus is on the hands, I love the lighting, the contrast, brilliant. He's actually pulled it off in this. Again, I want to straighten it a little bit, but overall, really atmospheric, and I like it. And I actually think I'd like to see Brooklyn tackle more event photography, to be honest, because if this is any indication, he could be great at it. He just needs to get the basics down first, you know? This shot, I think, has a really cool perspective. I feel like it says something. I want to keep looking at it. I find it interesting. I like this a lot. It shows a lot of potential. It's not perfect, but I quite like it, you know? Next up, we have another example of Brooklyn playing around with long exposures, and I don't necessarily think these photos themselves are good. I do think they do show potential and a willingness to learn and experiment and try new things and be creative, and I really hope he keeps trying with stuff like this because this is how you learn. Again, I have similar photos like this from when I was a teenager. The difference is they didn't end up publishing a book, you know? That said, here's an example of a time when he used long exposure perfectly to capture the movements of a crowd of people in a busy, I think it's a train station, I'm not sure. And I love this. I love this photo. Again, wish it was slightly less wonky, but I love what he's done. The contrast is brilliant. The use of black and white is brilliant. It looks busy and chaotic as it should. I think it's really great. I think this is a really good photo. And lastly, we have this one, which had the potential to be so good. Oh, and then Brooklyn ruined it with that damn elbow of his. Like, what is it about Brooklyn Beckham and elbows? Honestly, the composition is pretty decent of this. The focus is pretty spot on for once. The lighting is interesting. I really like it. But Brooklyn, tuck in your elbow, please. Like, when you're taking a photo like this, get out of the mirror. The fact you're in this reflection just ruins a really good picture. It completely throws off the rest of the shot. You can't see anything else because you're just focusing there on that stupid elbow, or at least I am. It really annoys me. With a moment like this that's really intense and is so focused on a face and a reflection like this, you want to forget that the photographer's there, not be reminded constantly that, oh, actually, there's a little boy hovering over his dad's shoulder while all this is happening, you know? But as annoying as it is, I can kind of forgive him for this because, you know, it's a rookie error. It's something he'll learn to look out for and avoid in time. And that's it, you know? He's still an amateur. He's a kid. He wasn't ready to have his work published like this. And that's my main problem with this book. While some photos show a lot of potential, it's only ever potential. He wasn't ready for this. He's not good enough for this yet. I personally have about 25 years of experience taking photos, and even I don't feel good enough already to put out, for example, a full photography book yet. I know I'm not good enough. How can anyone have thought Brooklyn Beckham would really be ready in 4 years? He's not a prodigy. This isn't some innate skill he has. It's just not ready. And whoever thought he was good enough to do the Burberry ad campaign 2 years after picking up a camera, it's insane. He didn't get that job because of skill. He got it because of nepotism, you know? And that's annoying as hell. Maybe in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, Brooklyn Beckham could or will become an excellent photographer. But at this point in his life, he's mildly capable. And he's not ready to be doing stuff like this. I do want to end though with this ridiculously accurate comment that my friend Meg made about this book, where she said, "It's like flicking through the profile picture album of a lad that got a camera for Christmas and now it's his whole personality." I thought that was funny and very accurate, and I just want to share that at the end of this. This is where I'm going to end today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you are interested in photography, please let me know what you thought of Brooklyn Beckham's photography book. Please let me know if more photography review videos are something you'd be interested in, and let me know what you thought of this. If you're new here, it would be great if you subscribe. If you've been around a while, please check you're still subscribed. Leave a like, leave a comment. Those kinds of things are really good for engagement and helping more people see my videos. If you'd like to help support my work, I do have a Patreon where you can go and see some of my own photographs. You can see video notes and script notes and stuff like that. You can see some behind the scenes stuff. I've got a little preview of my poetry book on there at the minute. If you'd like to get your own copy of my poetry book, it is available now from Amazon, but like I say, I'll be doing a proper full announcement soon. And yeah, I think that's pretty much me done. My voice is going a little bit because I've been talking for a while. Thank you for watching today. I appreciate you guys a lot, and I'll see you again very, very soon.